Psychological operations known as psyops appear as acts of war without cannons or tanks, but with objectives equivalent to an invasion, to achieve a situation desired by a higher authority. Their essence is to influence people's will and guide behavior through fear, hatred, or indifference. They can provoke feelings of loneliness, abandonment, and humiliation, erode morale, and induce socially undesirable behavior. They can also break combatants' momentum and lead them to surrender. They consist of techniques of alienation, alteration, and suggestion, designed to bend will and change mood. Their scope is not limited to the military. Any adversary whose interests oppose a superior power can become a target. The notion of a white war without blood is misleading. The ultimate purpose is the enemy's defeat and the obtaining of benefits, and the path is often paved with death and destruction. Their history goes back far. In World War I, the appearance of the first British tanks functioned as a psychological operation. Commanders knew that those slow, fragile, breakdown-prone machines would not by themselves transform the front. However, their main effect was the terror they inspired. The psychological result, more than tactical performance, produced the desired advantage. World War II multiplied these efforts in every theater. The planet was at war. Europe, Asia, and Southeast Asia burned in combat. Although the Americas lacked major battles, they participated in fronts and critical situations. Psychological warfare was used by both Allies and the Axis. In the Pacific, the figure nicknamed by Allied troops as Tokyo Rose emerged. The Japanese idea was to demoralize enemy combatants through radio. In camps and ships with few distractions after battle, radio became the center of attention. Through loudspeakers and receivers, a female voice in impeccable English conversed and played familiar music. Swing, blues, jazz, and, deliberately, Mexican songs, knowing that among the soldiers there were Latinos. The production was generated in Tokyo and retransmitted through a network of stations scattered across occupied islands, amplifying its reach. The goal was to convince soldiers that their struggle was meaningless, that defeat was certain, that death and suffering were inevitable, and that their country would fall before Japan. The broadcasts included false news that magnified Japanese victories. Given the limited access to verified reports on ships and in isolated fronts, these broadcasts could be believed. In some cases, they contributed to local surrenders. Among the most recognized voices was Eva Toguri, an American citizen of Japanese descent. In 1941, she traveled to Japan. The outbreak of war prevented her return. Without work, she entered radio. The Japanese military police forced her participation. During broadcasts boasting of sinkings and enemy casualties, she sometimes slipped in veiled warnings, comments anticipating attacks, hints of imminent bombings. At the end of the war, she was captured, taken to the United States, tried for treason, and punished with prison and loss of nationality. Decades later, in 1977, she received official apologies and her nationality was restored. She later died, closing a cycle in which she was seen both as an instrument and as an ambiguous figure of propaganda. The Axis had its mirror in Europe. Axis Sally, a female voice transmitting Nazi messages in perfect English. Mildred Gillars, an American living in Germany, became the sonic face of that strategy under Gestapo pressure. The operation targeted Western allies, where the psychological impact could be greatest. The messages were piercing, identifying names of captured pilots and soldiers, describing humiliating wounds, and insinuating broken marriages due to impotence or mutilations. They appealed to jealousy and insecurity, suggesting that girlfriends and wives were dancing and relating with men not mobilized while combatants faced death. They also incorporated anti-Semitic content, accusing Allied governments of sacrificing lives for the benefit of specific minorities. Later reports recorded real effects: loss of appetite, depression, and morale deterioration among U.S. troops. Axis, Sally's last transmission took place on May 6, 1945. Captured at the end of the conflict, Gillars was tried and imprisoned. After serving her sentence, she remained in the United States until her death in 1988. The United Kingdom perfected other notable maneuvers. Operation Mincemeat used the corpse of a man dressed as an officer with false documents to misinform and divert enemy attention. In parallel, a phantom army was deployed. Inflatable tanks, canvas decoys, and fake track marks created with machinery to simulate movements. To this were added fictitious communications, sent with discipline, to saturate and confuse enemy intelligence. Among the deepest operations was Huguenot, aimed at the German Air Force. After attacks and shoot-downs, psyops teams gathered names of pilots and crews, aircraft models, and combat details. Then they broadcast, imitating protocols and ciphers, false reports claiming voluntary surrenders with aircraft intact. The German command, receiving plausible messages it could not immediately verify, began to suspect desertions. Strict controls and disciplinary measures were imposed, ultimately eroding the morale of their own pilots. Combined with loss of material and human superiority, the psychological burden undermined willingness to fly as the war drew to its end. Another British masterpiece was Operation Aspidistra. A transmitter of extraordinary power was built, capable of crossing borders and supplanting signals. After thoroughly studying Radio Deutschland and other stations, announcers, musicalization, structure, near-perfect imitations were achieved. The technique allowed them to invade frequencies and broadcast false bulletins, sinkings that had not occurred, non-existent bombing warnings, imagined tactical changes. The consequences were tangible: massive, unnecessary evacuations, stoppages of industrial plants, diversion of squadrons, and logistical blockages motivated by false alarms. After the war, the system passed to the BBC and was used during the Cold War to interfere, block, and confuse transmissions in the Eastern Bloc. Over time, the saturation of falsehoods broke trust. Entire sectors stopped believing even when warnings were genuine, increasing real damage. In Korea, direct confrontation coexisted with propaganda. The United States used millions of pamphlets, messages, and psychological incentives. However, among North Korean and Chinese troops, indoctrination and collective discipline limited the effect of suggestion. Even if fears were planted, the structure of coercion and obedience nullified the usefulness of that emotion. The conflict led to a forced balance, with a stable dividing line and tense peace. The Philippines offered another unique scenario. After centuries of Spanish rule, U.S. intervention, and Japanese occupation, the Hukbalahap movement, HUK, emerged, an anti-Japanese guerrilla that, after the war, rose against a Philippine government perceived as a U.S. puppet. Local psychology became the key terrain. The population, with deep-rooted beliefs in curses, spirits, and nocturnal creatures, preserved its own practices and language. U.S. specialists designed pamphlets that did not directly attack the HUK, but mimicked curse tablets, warnings of misfortune for those who collaborated with the guerrilla. Meanwhile, infiltrated agents identified civilian leaders who supported the insurgents. At night, they painted with blood the Eye of God on their doors. At dawn, many fled in terror, disarticulating support networks. Pressure increased with staged effects. Selective ambushes that left bloodless bodies with ritual marks hanging in trees, evoking attacks by the Aswang or Manananggal, vampiric figures from folklore. Reports diverge on whether these actions were rare or frequent. On the other Asian front, North Korea and China practiced their own psychological warfare with Allied prisoners. Psychological torture and re-education sought mental breakdowns, public confessions, and testimonies to strike at enemy morale. Extreme cold, tactical stagnation, and exhaustion reinforced the invisible damage. The Vietnam War, referred to as the 10,000-Day War, deepened these methods. Beyond ideological lines, there was a shared belief in treating the dead. Honors, offerings, festivals of light, ritual money, and food for accompanying spirits. The United States tried to exploit this sensitivity with pamphlets insisting that dying far from home would prevent proper rituals and condemn souls to wander. The initiative had limited reach until the deployment of Operation Wandering Soul, carefully produced recordings with voices simulating relatives, laments, children's calls, and spectral whispers of dead soldiers mixed with sounds associated with funerals. To bring them to enemy ears, loudspeakers on night helicopters, river patrols with audio systems, and ground teams venturing into the jungle were used. The result was ambivalent. Sometimes Viet Cong gunfire to silence the sounds revealed positions, facilitating their annihilation. In other cases, panic spread to Allied villages and Southern units. Internal directives prohibited their reproduction near friendly populations. Even so, the practice endured and was replicated in later conflicts. In more recent years, music and noise as weapons were used again. In Panama, during the operation against Manuel Noriega, continuous exposure to sounds and songs sought to break psychological resistance. In Iraq, during the Gulf War and later campaigns, loudspeakers, pamphlets, and radio broadcasts combined to disorganize the adversary. The present brings psychological warfare to personal screens. A viral video with refined disinformation can impact millions in hours. Images generated by artificial intelligence and synthetic voices allow for believable fake news. Emails and messages circulate with audiovisual pieces where everything, scenes, voiceover, and script, is artificial yet convincing. Theories have been posed exploring combinations of media. False announcements on networks accompanied by sky projections with high-power lasers to simulate religious apparitions. Non-existent weather phenomena or flying objects capable of inducing collective panic. Included in this package is what some call Project Blue Beam. HAARP has also been mentioned, associated with atmospheric manipulation and frequencies capable of influencing moods. Another hypothesis, voice to skull, imagines the induction of voices directly perceived in the head through high-frequency signals, related to reports of the so-called Havana syndrome, where non-existent sounds and associated ailments were described. Though many of these proposals remain in the realm of conjecture, they all share the same horizon: intervening perception to direct behavior. Psyops do not necessarily require advanced technology. Sometimes a timely story is enough. In Mexico, in the mid-1990s, political, economic, and social crises accumulated: uprisings, political assassinations, and a convulsed country. In that context, the media began saturating the information space with reports of the so-called chupacabras. In prime time, newscasts, newspapers, and radios devoted wide coverage to supposed attacks. Communities organized night guards, public attention shifted. The monster figure operated as a psychological curtain, comparable, in its logic, to stories deployed in the Philippines or audio resources in Vietnam. Regardless of the existence or not of an unknown zoological phenomenon, the media effect worked as a massive distraction operation. Psychological warfare, far from being a clean contest, leaves concrete damage, paralyzing cities with false alarms, forcing unnecessary evacuations, pushing commanders to wrong decisions, and undermining social cohesion. When lies become routine, truth loses effectiveness. When trust breaks, even genuine warnings are ignored, with deadly consequences. Psyops feed on symbols, voices, and silences. They thrive where uncertainty dominates and verification is slow. The main battlefield is the human mind, and the prize, the capacity to decide. By the nature of the subject, certain details remain outside open exposition. History suggests, however, that many operations remain invisible until long after execution. Some are only intuited by their effects: unexpected surrenders, sudden shifts in collective mood, media obsessions that erupt and fade. The record of a century shows that alongside cannons and tanks, there exists a machinery of persuasion that, without firing, reshapes perceived reality and redraws the maps of power.